For a growing number of modern professionals, the first few hours of the day are defined by deep focus and 0 calories. This is the core of intermittent fasting. By extending the overnight fast well into the morning, the goal is to force the body to oxidize stored fat for energy while maintaining high cognitive clarity. But this strategy conflicts with global public health data. This split screen compares a 16-hour fasting window with a forest plot of health outcomes. Highlighting the clinical data, breakfast omission correlates with elevated hazard ratios for type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and obesity. To understand this discrepancy, we have to look at how these studies define the first meal. They aren't looking at generic snacking. They measure the precise physiological impact of energy consumed strictly within 2 hours of waking up. The consequences of missing this specific window have little to do with a daily caloric deficit. The risks stem directly from the disruption of human chronobiology. After an entire night of sleep, the human body wakes up in a heavily post-absorptive state. Your system is entirely depleted of glycogen. Forcing the body to operate in that depleted state correlates tightly with cardiometabolic risk. We see this across massive population studies, including major cohorts tracked by institutions like the Harvard School of Public Health. Missing this first meal actively triggers low-grade systemic inflammation. Prolonged morning fasting also correlates with elevated fasting lipid concentrations and chronic circadian disruption. The variable that determines whether someone thrives or suffers in this state is metabolic flexibility. This is the body's mechanical ability to efficiently switch between burning carbohydrates and stored fats. Bypassing the morning meal entirely shifts the endocrine baseline and hormonal sensitivity for the remainder of the day. Omitting breakfast physically changes how your gastrointestinal tract releases the peptides that control appetite. This diagram illustrates the peripheral mechanisms of appetite regulation, mapping how the gut communicates with the central brain. The green pathways indicate orexigenic signals, which stimulate the drive to eat. Notice the prominent role of the hormone ghrelin here. The red pathways represent the inhibitory signals, specifically the satiation hormones PYY and GLP-1, which originate in the gastrointestinal tract and tell the brain to stop eating. Clinical trials show that the circulating levels of these critical satiation hormones, PYY and GLP-1, are significantly higher following a morning meal. When subjects consume the exact same amount of calories, but only after an extended morning fast, the release of those satiation hormones is severely blunted. By bypassing the morning feeding window, you break the gut's satiation signaling mechanism. Your brain loses the ability to accurately regulate appetite later in the day. This endocrine dysregulation leads directly to a physiological phenomenon known as the second meal effect. Consuming a meal in the morning actively primes your body's glycogen storage capacity. It prepares your biological systems to efficiently process future nutrient loads. This graph plots the area under the curve for blood glucose and insulin across a 12-hour window. Line A traces the trajectory of a habitual breakfast eater. Notice the moderate, highly controlled glucose bump occurring right after the morning meal. As line A continues to the midday point, we see another stable, controlled glucose response immediately following lunch. Now look at line B, tracking the breakfast skipper. The morning curve remains flat and completely depleted, but at the midday mark, line B spikes massively. This represents a highly dysregulated, exaggerated surge in both insulin and blood glucose. This exaggerated metabolic spike happens even when the lunch provided to the skipper contains the exact same macronutrients and calories as the lunch given to the breakfast eater. Strict caloric restriction in the morning forces an inefficient, damaging endocrine overreaction to standard meals in the afternoon. Blood sugar volatility forces a reaction from the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, initiating a systemic stress response. We see this acutely in female physiology. Data indicates that female breakfast skippers display a distinctly disrupted daily cortisol rhythm. That altered circulating cortisol changes how the body handles minor stress, directly linking the fasted state to mood swings and elevated blood pressure. Over time, this stress response compromises immune function, specifically reducing monocyte activity and leaving the body vulnerable to infection. When these scattered responses are mapped across human anatomy, the long-term clinical risks become obvious. Looking at the pancreas, the dysregulation caused by the second meal effect is a direct pathway to insulin resistance and type 2 diabetes. In the vascular system, the combination of altered lipid profiles and elevated blood pressure contributes to a hardening of the arteries. Uncalibrated morning fasting acts as an acute systemic stressor on a vulnerable body. The consequences of this stress become clearest when we zoom out to look at global epidemiology. In Japan, macro-level observations reveal a clear paradox. The overall daily energy intake of the population has decreased, yet the percentage of obese individuals has simultaneously climbed. Researchers link this specific outcome to the increasingly popular modern habit of erratic meal timing and skipping breakfast. In populations that lack strict overall dietary control, especially pediatric subjects and young adults, chronic meal omission consistently correlates with central adiposity and metabolic syndrome. Broad public health data proves that erratic meal omission routinely backfires, producing the exact metabolic dysfunction that fasting attempts to prevent. This brings us back to the initial paradox. Why does skipping breakfast yield leanness and productivity for a specific fitness demographic, but obesity and inflammation for the general public? The outcome depends entirely on two variables. This matrix graphs intentional fasting against erratic omission on the x-axis and a flexible versus compromised metabolic baseline on the y-axis. In the top right quadrant, lean, metabolically adapted individuals use intentional fasting to successfully activate genes associated with fat burning. But in the bottom left quadrant, featuring obese or insulin-resistant adults, this fat-burning effect is entirely absent. For individuals in this compromised quadrant, skipping a meal triggers impaired glucose homeostasis and elevates cardiometabolic risk. Skipping breakfast acts as a metabolic stress test, one that only highly adapted physiological systems pass. The clinical consensus is clear. For vulnerable populations, including growing children and those prone to glycemic crashes, breakfast is a necessary metabolic jumpstart. Maintaining GLP-1 sensitivity and mitigating the damage of the second meal effect relies heavily on morning nutrient intake. The calories you ingest are not time agnostic. The human body operates strictly as a circadian machine. The endocrine response to food is dictated by when that food is introduced. True metabolic health requires respecting the body's internal clock just as much as its caloric balance.